I want to thank Reverend Irvin for that wonderful message. Before I begin, I would like to thank my pastor. I know he's probably streaming right now, so I thank him for the opportunity to preach. I want to acknowledge his lovely wife. I want to acknowledge the best group of associate ministers on planet Earth sitting down there. I'd like to recognize both of my beautiful daughters, Zaria and Mackenzie. And I would also like to recognize my best friend, my wife, Tawana. So if you would, turn with me to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. And we will begin our reading at verse 36. Mark chapter 5, verse 36. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw the tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said something should be given her to eat. May there be a blessing to the reading and the hearing and doing of God's holy word. Verse 36. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." A few years ago, there was a book written called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. The book was written by a nurse whose job was to care for those who were on their deathbed. And while she was caring for those on their deathbed, she asked them, "What is the top things, or number one things that you regret throughout your lifetime?" And the number one regret that those on their deathbed regretted is that they regretted not having the courage to step out and doing the thing that God had called them to do. That they regretted not having the courage to do the thing that they had in their heart to do. And tonight, there may be somebody under the sound of my voice who may be too afraid to step out and do the thing that God has called you to do. Well, my message to you tonight is a simple message. It's the same message that scholars say is the number one theme throughout the Bible. It's the same message that scholars say Jesus said more than any other phrase throughout his time here on earth. It's the same message that's listed in verse 36. Do not be afraid, only believe. That's what I want to talk about tonight. If you have a dream inside of you, if you have something that God has placed in your heart, do not be afraid, only believe. In our text, Jesus had just performed a series of miracles. Jesus had just calmed the raging seas. Jesus had just cast demons out of a man. Jesus, just as Pastor preached last week, Jesus had just healed a woman who had a blood flow issue for the past 12 years. And in our text tonight, Jairus, the local leader of a synagogue, he has a problem on his hands. His daughter is dying. Jairus, he hears about Jesus, and he hears the things that Jesus has done. So Jairus goes to find Jesus. And when he finds Jesus, he tells Jesus about his daughter and tells Jesus that his daughter is dying and asks Jesus to help him. Jesus looked at Jairus and he agrees to go and help him. But before they could make any progress, some people in the crowd come running to Jairus and said, "There's no need to bother Jesus because your daughter is already dead." But Jesus, being Jesus, he turns to Jairus and he says, "We're still going to go because I have resurrection power." But when the crowd heard Jesus say that, the crowd ridiculed Jesus and they laughed at Jesus. And just like they laughed at Jesus, Jesus was about to do something great. Just like they laughed at him, when you are about to do something great, when you finally have the courage to step out and do the thing that God had called you to do, don't be surprised if you get laughed at. You may get laughed at when you say you're going to start your own business. You may get laughed at when you say that you're going to be a New York Times best-selling author. You may get laughed at when you say that you're going to be the first person in your family to graduate from college. You may get laughed at when you say that you're going to go and get you a basketball, soccer scholarship. You may get laughed at when you finally step out and do the thing that God had called you to do. You might get laughed at. But when you get laughed at, you got to do the same thing that Jesus did in verse 37. He said that Jesus permitted no one except Peter, James, and John to go with him. So in essence, what Jesus did, Jesus cut off the negative crowd, and he surrounded himself with 3 believers. So whenever you get the courage to step out and do the thing that God had called you to do, you got to cut off the negative crowd and surround yourself with a body of believers. Because when you have a dream inside of you, when you have something that God has told you to do, you got to protect it. And the only way that you can protect it, you got to surround yourself with a body of believers. And just know that when you do that, sometimes your biggest blessing is going to come from a dead situation. Jairus had a dead situation on his hands. Story told of a young boy, an artist, in Kansas City, Missouri. He worked for a newspaper in Kansas City, Missouri. He'd worked at the newspaper for about 6 months. He walked in to work one day, and his boss called him in and said, "Son, come have a sit down." He said, "Son, we've looked at your work that you've done for the past 6 months, and we just don't think that your quality work is up to the standards of this newspaper. As a matter of fact, we don't think that being an artist is anything that you should pursue any further. And to help you not pursue this anymore, we're going to have to let you go." Being fired from his job that day was the last thing that that young boy was expecting to hear. At that moment, that young boy had a dead situation on his hands. He only had $13 to his name and 1 bag of clothes. He didn't have any family. But he said to himself, "I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe." So the young boy took the $13 he had and he bought him a bus ticket and took it to California. He didn't know where he was going. He just kept saying to himself, I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe that this is my destiny. When he got to California, he started looking for work and he couldn't find any work. But just so happened, a local leader of a local church bumped into this young boy. And just so happened, the church was looking for an artist, and because they wanted to start advertising in the newspaper. And the young boy said, hey, I'm an artist. I can do it. The church leader looked at him and said, well, we would love to have you, but we can't afford to pay you anything. But what we can do is we can offer you a place to stay in our basement. So the young boy said, well, I don't have anything to lose. I'll take it. I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe that this is my destiny. So the young boy took the job, and when he got to the basement, he quickly realized that the basement was infested with mice. Like most people would get out of Dodge, but the young boy said, I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe that this is my destiny. So at night, the young boy would sleep, and the mice would come running aside his head. But the young boy, when he was sleeping, he would keep saying to himself, I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe that this is my destiny. And the young boy who didn't have any friends, he started thinking to himself, well, since the mice are running alongside my head and I don't have any friends, I might as well make friends with these mice. So the young man made friends with the mice, and he started playing with the mice night after night. And then the young man started looking and said, you know what? There's something different about these mice. And before long, he picked up his pen and his pad, and he said, you know what? It really is something different about these mice. So he started drawing the mice night after night. He just started drawing the mice. It is something different about these mice. And then he started passing out the drawings of the mice. At first, they didn't catch on, but after a while, they did catch on. And today, if you're ever in Florida or California, I invite you to take your family to see the big mouse, Mickey Mouse. That young boy was Walt Disney. You see, Walt Disney had a dead situation on his hands, but Walt Disney said, I'm not going to be afraid. I'm just going to believe. That's what you got to do. You can't be afraid. You got to believe. Whatever it is in your heart, don't be afraid. Only believe. That's the message. It's so great to be in the house of the Lord. First, I would like to thank Pastor Stevenson for this opportunity to preach. I just want you to know that I don't take this lightly, so thank you for the opportunity. Next, I would like to recognize the greatest group of associate ministers on planet Earth, listed down there. I would like to recognize both of my beautiful daughters, Zaria and Mackenzie. I'd like to thank you for your support in your own special way. You support me. And lastly, I would like to recognize my best friend, my wife, Tawana. She continues to push me to be better, and I just thank you for everything that you do. It's a benefit to have a spouse who understands the demands of ministry continues to encourage me. So I thank you for everything that you do. And so if you would, turn with me to John chapter 17. John chapter 17. And we'll begin our reading at verse number 1, and we'll culminate at verse number 5. John chapter 17, verses 1 through 5. Jesus spoke these words, lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you. And you have given him authority over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as you have given him. And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. May there be a blessing to the reading, hearing, and doing of God's holy word. Verse number 4. I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. Over the past month, Pastor has been preaching a series on living in obedience to God. Just 3 weeks ago, my wife and we had to make a major decision. My wife was offered a position out of state. And before we married, we promised one another that we would always be flexible and support one another with career opportunities. And although she is in leadership in her chosen field of healthcare, this too was a position of leadership. They said that they wanted her to come implement her vision at this particular hospital. They said, whatever you want to do, we're willing to do it because we value your leadership. And when we saw the offer sheet, we knew that they were serious. It was more money than I had ever made in my life, and it was more money than she had ever made in her life. So we went through the process of outlining the pros and cons of accepting, declining, what it would mean for our children. But it was during this process that we remembered that we also made another promise to one another. That we promised that we would always consult God on decisions. So we prayed and we prayed. And God gave us an answer. So we went through the process of composing an email with the response, the answer that God had given us. And we looked at one another and we said, are we really going to do this? And I watched as my wife's finger shook as she pushed the send button with the answer that God had given us. He said no to stay here because I still have work here for you to do. Well, my question for you tonight, what is the work that God has for you to do? Throughout planet Earth, there are more than 7 billion people. And of that number, 2.3 billion of us are Christians. But
But there's one thing that all of us have in common. God has given each of us an assignment. And so tonight, my message is a simple message. It's the same message that's listed in verse number 1. The hour has come. That's what I want to talk about. The hour has come to finish the work, the assignment that God has given you. In our text, in order to understand John chapter 17, we must capture it in a historical lens. Throughout the Bible, God has always given great men of faith assignments. Abraham was given an assignment. His assignment was to pack his things and go to a land that he didn't know. Abraham finished his assignment. And because Abraham finished his assignment, he was blessed. Noah, who scholars call the second Adam, was given an assignment. His assignment was to build a boat because God was going to bring a great flood. And although it had never rained, Noah's assignment was to build a boat. Noah finished his assignment. And because Noah finished his assignment, Noah and his family were saved from the flood. They were blessed. Moses was given an assignment. His assignment was to lead the people from bondage. And although Moses didn't feel that he was qualified because he stuttered, God says, your assignment is to lead the people from bondage. Moses finished his assignment. And because Moses finished his assignment, an entire nation were blessed. Joshua was given an assignment. His assignment was to go through the Jordan. Joshua, we know him as a great man of war, but Joshua was afraid of the Jordan. But God says, Joshua, I have blessings for you on the other side of the Jordan, the land flowing with milk and honey, but you got to go through the Jordan. The Jordan, at this time, the waters had risen at this time. The waters were raging. But God says, Joshua, I need you to go through the Jordan. The Jordan represented danger, because if they tried to go through the Jordan, somebody may not make it. Somebody may drown. But God says, Joshua, just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. Just as I parted the Red Sea, I will make a way for you when you get to the Jordan. But all you got to do is get to the Jordan. And so tonight, somebody under the sound of my voice, God has given you an assignment. But just like Joshua, you're too afraid to step out and do it. But I come to tell you tonight that the fear that you have inside, at some point, it got to meet the God that you know. Jesus had an assignment. Throughout the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they call the Synoptic Gospels because they have the same stories in them. Matthew starts with the genealogy of Christ. From birth, Jesus has an assignment. His assignment is to ultimately get to the cross. But in our text, the book of John is different from the Synoptic Gospels. John gives us a different lens. It gives us the lens of Jesus' hour, the reason he was put here on earth. His hour. You often hear Jesus saying that his hour is coming or his hour hadn't come yet. But here in John chapter 17, he says, my hour has come. The reason I came here has come. John chapter 17 is unique to any other chapter throughout the Bible. John chapter 17, this is the only place where you will find an in-depth prayer of Jesus. This is the only place that you will find it. We hear that Jesus prays. We know that Jesus prays a lot. But we either are told that Jesus goes and prays, and that's all we know, or we're told something in general, such as when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "Thy will be done." And that's all we know. But here in John chapter 17, we have 26 verses of Jesus praying. And now you may say, what about the Lord's Prayer? No, the Lord's Prayer is not Jesus praying. That's Jesus teaching the disciples how to pray and teaching us how to pray. But John chapter 17 is Jesus praying. Jesus first prays for himself. Then he prays for his disciples, those who are closest to him. Then he prays for future believers. He was praying for us. And just like Jesus prayed, the assignment that you have on your life is time to pray. Because when you finish the assignment that God has put on your life, it's not only going to affect you, it's going to have an effect on those closest to you, your family. And it's going to have an effect on those coming after you, the legacy that you leave behind. And when you finally get up the courage to say that I'm ready to finish the assignment that God has given me, you can be confident in knowing that God has already given you all the tools that you need to finish your assignment. Look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, "As you have given him authority over all flesh," Jesus, who has two natures, a divine and human nature. Jesus was able to heal the sick. Jesus was able to raise the dead. Jesus was able to forgive sin. That's something that only the Messiah could do. And I come to tell you tonight, when God gives you an assignment, you are the only one that can do it. God has given it specifically to you. So all you got to do is go out there and do it. God has given you a sound mind. God has given you resources. God has given you ideas. God has given you everything that you need to finish the assignment that he has put on your life. And just know, when you finally decide to say that I'm going to finish the assignment that God has put on my life, God will get the ultimate glory. But in the process, you will be blessed. Story told of a young boy who at an early age felt that God had put an assignment on his life. The young boy's father was a struggling insurance salesman. His mother was a hard worker. It was reported that the only time that this young boy saw his mother's eyes close is when she laid in her casket on her funeral. This young boy had a love for cooking, and he had a dream of one day opening his own restaurant. This young boy was often seen walking around with cardboard at the bottom of his shoes because he couldn't afford new ones. This young boy wasn't particularly smart in school, so he had a very low self-esteem. But this young boy had a love for cooking, and he felt that God had given him an assignment. So the young boy decided to forego college, and he said, I'm going to go after the assignment that God has put on my life. This young boy who loved to cook said that he was going to work hard and save his money so that one day he'll be able to open his restaurant. So the young boy who loved to cook started working. Years that went by, and he was finally able to open his restaurant. That was the happiest day of that young boy's life. The restaurant thrived. Years went by. Everything was going well. And one night, the young boy received a phone call. On the other end, the caller said, your restaurant is on fire. So the young boy who loved to cook kept his restaurant open 24 hours a day, went down to see his restaurant. And when he got down there was nothing to see. Everything was in ashes. This young boy who loved to cook he still felt that God had an assignment for his life. So instead of quitting, he said, I'm just going to rebuild. So this young boy who loved to cook, he said, I'm going to keep working and save up to reopen my restaurant. So this young boy who loved to cook started working and saving. Years had went by. And this young boy was able to reopen his restaurant. This young boy who loved to cook kept his restaurant open 24 hours a day. It started thriving. People from all over came to visit this young boy's restaurant. But one night, the young boy received a phone call. The caller on the other end said, your restaurant is on fire. So the young boy goes down to see his restaurant. And just like the first time, there was nothing to see. It was burned down to ashes. So this young boy who loved to cook, he started thinking to himself, what did he do wrong? Did he leave a door open? Did he leave a pot on? So this young boy started pondering what went wrong. And after so long, he discovered what went wrong, and it seemed like his eyes were suddenly open. So this young boy who loved to cook, he was sitting on an airplane one day, and he noticed that the airline industry, they served one set of food, but then they had a second set of food that they didn't serve. They called them leftovers. So this young boy who loved to cook started thinking to himself, I think I can do something with these leftovers. So the days and weeks that went by, this young boy who loved to cook kept thinking about the leftovers that he saw on the airplane. It just couldn't shake his mind. So the young boy started mixing and matching with the leftovers, and before long, the young boy had him a good dish. So this young boy who loved to cook started passing out his dish to people in the community. And people in the community loved this dish so much, they started telling people outside the state to come taste this dish. And people who came out of the state loved this dish. They started asking people internationally to start flying in to taste this dish. And the people said that we got a great dish. We got to give this name a dish. Matter of fact, this dish is so good, we can't just give it an English name. We got to find a French name to describe this dish. And so tonight, if you're hungry, take your family out and taste this dish. Pull up to the drive-thru and ask for the filet at Chick-fil-A. That young boy was Samuel L. Cassie. You see, Kathy had an assignment on his life, but God wasn't going to get the glory as long as his restaurant was open 24 hours a day. That's where he went wrong. And today, when Chick-fil-A is closed on Sunday, it serves as a silent witness to the world that when you put God first, when you go after the assignment that God has put on your life, he will get the glory and you will be blessed. That's the message.